They laughed when I poured 4,000 live shad into my orchard's irrigation ditch instead of buying the nitrogen blend the extension office recommended. That was March of 2019, 11 months after my grandfather died, 6 weeks after Hargrove Hospitality offered me $2.1 million for 86 acres I had no intention of selling. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, if you've ever been told your inheritance was worthless by someone wearing shoes that cost more than your truck. There was the letter from Hargrove Hospitality, sitting on my grandfather's roll-top desk, promising to close in 60 days if I signed, threatening eminent domain language, dressed up as a courtesy notice if I didn't. There was the way my neighbors started crossing the road to avoid small talk, the way Doris Calvert told the Rotary Club I'd lost my mind grieving out there alone, with nothing but a dead man's notebooks for company. And there was the ledger itself, 17 leather-bound volumes going back to 1961, my grandfather Ellis Whitfield's handwriting cramped into every margin, and one line underlined 3 times in the last volume he ever filled: "Water remembers what soil forgets." My grandfather bought this land in 1961 for $11 an acre, back when the county called it worthless red clay, unfit for anything but scrub pine. He proved them wrong for 58 years, running cattle, then switching to pecans and muscadine grapes when his knees gave out on him in the 80s. He never remarried after my grandmother passed. He raised me from age 9, after my parents' accident, teaching me to read weather in the way cattle bunched against a fence line, to read drought in the color of a sycamore's underleaf turning silver 3 days before anyone else noticed. He talked to me the way he talked to the land, which is to say rarely, and only when it mattered. Waste nothing, trust what you can measure twice, and never let a man in a clean shirt tell you what your dirt is worth. That last one he said to me the week before he died, sitting on the porch with an oxygen line clipped under his nose, watching a survey truck idle at the end of our drive without permission. He'd seen it coming, the resort. Cresthaven Properties had been buying up the ridge above Miller's Creek for 3 years, farm by farm, cash offers wrapped in confidentiality agreements, and by the time Hargrove Hospitality broke ground on the resort itself, my grandfather's 86 acres sat like a stubborn tooth in the middle of what would become their golf course frontage. He didn't live to see the grand opening. I buried him in November, and by the following February, Cresthaven's development arm had rebranded, spent $40 million, and opened the Aldermere, a 5-star resort with 210 rooms, an 18-hole course, and a farm-to-table restaurant that needed, according to their own marketing materials, quote, locally sourced ingredients with an authentic southern provenance. My 86 acres sat directly between their 18th hole and their water treatment easement. They wanted me gone, and they wanted it done quietly. The man who came to my door in January, 3 months after the funeral, introduced himself as Preston Hargrove, Senior Vice President of Land Acquisition, and he smiled the way men smile when they've never once in their life been told no and meant it. He wore ostrich skin boots that had clearly never touched a field, and he stood on my grandfather's porch describing my inheritance as, quote, an underutilized asset with significant redevelopment potential, like he was reading off a spreadsheet instead of standing on the ground where I'd learned to walk. $2.1 million, he said, was more than generous for 86 acres of, and here he actually paused to choose the word, marginal agricultural land. I told him I'd think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it, but I'd learned from my grandfather that you never show a man like that your hand before you have to. The soil samples came back in February and they confirmed what I already suspected from walking the orchard rows with my grandfather's old probe. The pecan trees along the eastern boundary, the ones closest to where the resort's new water treatment runoff drained into Miller's Creek, were showing signs of nitrogen depletion that didn't match any pattern in 50 years of his ledgers. Something in the creek water had shifted. The county extension agent, a clipped, efficient man named Roy Dennison, who wore a lanyard even when he wasn't required to, came out at my request and walked the rows with a photometer, testing leaf tissue, nodding along in a way that felt less like agreement and more like a man rehearsing his own conclusion. His recommendation was a synthetic nitrogen program, $2,200 a season, applied in 3 rounds. Standard protocol, he called it, the kind of thing you'd find in any extension bulletin. I told him I wanted to try something else first. He looked at me the way you look at a child, insisting the stove isn't hot. Ma'am, he said, With respect to your grandfather, sentiment doesn't fix a nitrogen deficiency. I didn't argue. I'd learned that from Ellis Whitfield, too. You don't argue with a man who's already decided you're foolish. You let the ground argue for you. Later, when he can't pretend not to hear it. What Roy Dennison didn't know, because I hadn't told him, was that my grandfather's ledger from 1974 described almost the identical leaf discoloration during a drought year, and his solution wasn't nitrogen. It was fish. Threadfin shad, run through the irrigation ditches at the base of the root systems, left to decompose slowly into the clay, releasing nutrients in a rhythm the trees could actually absorb, instead of a synthetic jolt that leached straight through sandy topsoil in the first hard rain. He'd learned it, he wrote, from watching herons work the creek after a flood, from noticing which trees near old fish kill sites came back greener the following spring than trees 50 yards away. Water remembers what soil forgets. I drove 2 hours to a hatchery in Sumter County and bought 4,000 live shad for $1,800, nearly every dollar I had left after the funeral costs and the property taxes, and I hauled them home in aerated tanks in the bed of my grandfather's 1998 Ford, the water sloshing over the sides on every turn, the smell of it clinging to my hands for 2 days, no matter how many times I scrubbed them raw. I dumped them into the ditch system myself, alone, at 5 in the morning before anyone on the road could see, working the length of the eastern boundary in rubber waders that leaked at the left knee, the March air still cold enough to fog in front of my face, the shad thrashing silver in the low light like a seam of quicksilver running through the mud. It took 4 hours. By the time Doris Calvert drove past on her way to the feed store and slowed her truck to stare, I was already hosing the smell off the tailgate, and the story was already halfway to town before I'd finished breakfast. If you've ever done the unpopular thing alone at 5 in the morning because you were the only one who believed it would work, hit subscribe now, because what happened to those trees 18 months later is the reason I'm still standing on this land. By April, the smell had faded, but the story hadn't. Doris Calvert told anyone who'd listen at the Rotary Club luncheon that Ellis Whitfield's granddaughter had gone strange with grief, dumping baitfish in her ditches like some kind of backwoods ritual, and she said it with a laugh that wasn't unkind exactly, just certain, the laugh of a woman who'd never once doubted her own judgment about anything. She'd been my grandfather's neighbor for 31 years and had never once brought a casserole after his funeral, but she found time to repeat the fish story at 3 separate church functions that spring. I didn't correct her. I let her talk. My grandfather used to say that explaining yourself to someone who's already laughing costs you dignity and buys you nothing. Roy Dennison came back in May for a follow-up inspection, required, he said, for my continued eligibility in the county's agricultural exemption program, though I suspected Cresthaven's people had put in a call requesting it. He walked the eastern rows again, and this time the leaf color had shifted, not dramatically, but enough that a trained eye would catch it, a deepening from the sickly yellow-green of February to something closer to healthy. He crouched at the base of one tree, dug 2 inches down with a hand trowel, and found what remained of the shad, a slick dark residue working its way into the root zone. He stood up, brushed his knees off, and told me, not unkindly, that anecdotal folk methods weren't a substitute for a documented nutrient management plan, and that if the trees improved it was more likely due to spring rainfall patterns than to, and he gestured at the ditch, whatever this was. I thanked him for his time. I wrote his exact words in my grandfather's ledger that night, dated, in the cramped hand I'd learned from watching him fill 40 years of pages. Dennison, May 14th, calls it anecdotal. I underlined it once, not for spite, for the record. A second visitor came in June, a Cresthaven attorney named Marguerite Salas, sent to, in her words, clarify the boundary language in the original 1961 deed regarding creek access rights, which was corporate shorthand for testing whether they could claim my irrigation easement without paying for it. She was polished in a way Preston Hargrove wasn't, softer spoken, more dangerous for it, and she suggested, almost gently, that continued disputes over creek access could complicate my agricultural exemption status with the county, an implied threat wrapped so carefully in professional courtesy that it took me a full minute to recognize it for what it was. I told her the deed language was unambiguous and that my grandfather had filed the survey himself in 1961, and that she was welcome to review it at the courthouse. She left without her clarification. I added her name to the ledger too, in the same cramped hand, dated, because my grandfather taught me that a record kept quietly is worth more than an argument shouted loudly, and that the people who underestimate you will eventually hand you, in their own words, every piece of evidence you need. I remember the exact texture of that June afternoon, the way the humidity sat thick enough to fog the inside of the truck windows, the smell of cut hay drifting over from the Patterson's field, 2 properties down, the particular green-gold light that falls through pecan leaves in early summer, just before the heat gets unbearable. Marguerite Salas had driven a rental car with rental car tires, the kind that spin uselessly in the loose gravel of my drive, and she'd had to park at the end and walk in dress shoes, which told me more about how Cresthaven valued this land than anything in her prepared remarks. I offered her water. She declined. My grandfather always said you offer water to everyone who steps onto your land, friend or otherwise, because how a person receives hospitality tells you the whole of their character in under a minute. She drank nothing, said her piece, and left with dust on her heels, and I went back to checking the ditch lines, the shad long since dissolved into the clay, invisible now except in what the trees were quietly becoming. The sharpest cut came in August, at the County Agricultural Fair, where Doris Calvert had somehow gotten herself onto the judging committee for the Orchard Products Division. My muscadine jelly, made from the same rows my grandfather had planted in 1988, took second place behind hers, and when I went to collect the ribbon, she said, loud enough for the row of folding chairs behind her to hear, that she supposed grief does strange things to a person's palate, and that fishwater jelly probably had, quote, an acquired taste. A few people laughed, not everyone, but enough. I stood there holding a red ribbon instead of a blue one, in 96-degree heat, with the smell of fried dough and diesel generators thick in the air, and for the first time since the funeral, I let myself feel the full weight of being alone in this. No father, no grandfather, no husband, nobody standing behind me at a folding table, while a woman who'd never once helped me haul a single crate laughed at my dead grandfather's methods, in front of half the county. I drove home that night with the windows down, the ribbon on the passenger seat, and I sat on the porch until almost midnight, the ledger open on my knees to a page from 1979 I'd read 100 times before. My grandfather had written it during a year when a drought killed off 2/3 of the county's cattle herds, and half his neighbors sold out to a feedlot conglomerate rather than ride it out. Every man on this ridge thinks patience is the same as losing, he'd written. It isn't. Patience is just losing slower than the story anyone's willing to believe. I sat with that a long time. Then I went inside, and the next morning I was back in the orchard by 6, checking irrigation lines, because his handwriting on a page from 40 years before my birth was still, somehow, the only voice steady enough to keep me standing. I won't pretend that night didn't cost me something. I sat with the porch light off, because moths gathered too thick around it in August, and I let myself run through every version of the life I could have had if I'd taken Preston Hargrove's money that first winter and moved somewhere nobody knew my name or my grandfather's methods, somewhere a red ribbon at a county fair couldn't undo 2 years of grief in under a sentence. The crickets were loud that night, the kind of loud that fills every silence between thoughts, and somewhere down toward the creek a barred owl was calling, the same call my grandfather used to imitate badly on the porch when I was a girl, just to make me laugh before bed. I thought about how he never once, in 58 years of working this ridge, let another man's opinion of his methods change what he wrote in that ledger. Not when the bank questioned his cattle rotation in 1968, not when the co-op dropped him from their buying program in 1991 over a dispute about grading standards he refused to compromise on. He kept writing, he kept measuring, he let the land answer for him, on its own schedule, and I understood, sitting there with the ribbon still red under the porch light I eventually turned back on, that I owed him at minimum that same discipline, whether or not Doris Calvert ever tasted the difference in my jelly. The drought that broke everything open started in April of the following year, and didn't let go until late September, the worst dry spell the region had logged since 1986, according to the State Agricultural Extension's own bulletin, which Roy Dennison himself distributed to every farm on the mailing list. Rainfall across the county came in at 11 inches below the 5-year average. Cresthaven's golf course, which had been irrigating with a synthetic fertilizer and municipal water blend to keep those 18 holes photograph-ready for their marketing brochures, watched their newly planted rough go brittle and gold by July, and their water bill, according to a leaked county utilities report that made its way into the local paper, had climbed to over $40,000 a month just trying to keep the greens alive. Half the pecan orchards on the ridge, the ones running the standard synthetic nitrogen program Roy Dennison had recommended to me back in February, saw their yields collapse by nearly 40%. The trees stressed past the point where any amount of late-season fertilizer could save the crop, because synthetic nitrogen leaches fast and does nothing for a root system's actual water retention. My eastern rows, the ones I'd soaked with $4,000 of dying shad 18 months earlier, told a different story. The decomposing fish had done exactly what my grandfather's 1974 notes predicted: broken down slowly into the clay, built up an organic layer that held water in the root zone the way synthetic granules never could, fed a fungal network in the soil that Roy Dennison's photometer had never been built to measure. When I ran my own yield count that October, standing in the orchard with a hand scale and a notebook the way my grandfather taught me, instead of trusting some corporate agronomist's projection, the eastern rows came in at 1,840 pounds of pecans per acre. The county average that year, according to the Extension Office's own published figures, was 1,110 pounds. My muscadine vines, irrigated from the same fish-fed ditches, produced a harvest so far ahead of the drought-stunted neighboring vineyards that a produce buyer from 3 counties over drove out unannounced in September, having heard from a hotel chef that there was a woman on Miller's Creek Road growing grapes that tasted like they'd never noticed the drought at all. Preston Hargrove came back to my porch in October, 18 months after his first visit, and he wasn't wearing the ostrich skin boots this time. He wore ordinary loafers caked in dust from walking a golf course that had gone the color of straw, and the confidence he'd carried like a second skin the first time had thinned into something closer to strain around his eyes. The Aldermere's opening season numbers had come in soft, he admitted, though he tried to dress it up as market conditions rather than what it actually was, which was 210 hotel rooms full of guests who'd paid $400 a night for a farm-to-table restaurant that couldn't source a single reliable ingredient because every conventional farm on the ridge had failed to deliver on contract that season. Their executive chef, he told me, almost sheepishly, had been driving to 3 different farmers' markets a week trying to patch together enough produce to keep the menu credible, and guest reviews had started mentioning the gap between the marketing and the plate. He asked, in a voice that had lost every trace of the man who'd once called my land marginal, whether I might consider a supply agreement. Not a sale, a contract. He used the word partnership twice, which from a man like Preston Hargrove was as close to an apology as I was ever going to get. I let the silence sit longer than it needed to. Somewhere behind him, past the tree line, I could hear the faint hum of the resort's irrigation pumps still running, still losing the fight against a drought my grandfather's methods had already answered 18 months in advance. I told him I'd need to see the numbers on what they were offering. He said he'd have his team draft terms by the end of the week. I told him I'd be at the county's agricultural exchange meeting on the 15th, along with everyone else who wanted to talk business, and that he was welcome to make his case there, in front of whoever else showed up. It wasn't generous. It was deliberate. My grandfather never let a man negotiate in private who'd humiliated him in public. The County Agricultural Exchange meets the 3rd Tuesday of every month in the Fairgrounds Exhibit Hall, the same building where Doris Calvert's Jelly had beaten mine 18 months earlier, and on the 15th of October it was standing room only, because word had gotten around that Preston Hargrove himself would be there, and word had also gotten around, faster and further, that the woman everyone had laughed at over a truckload of fish was posting the county's highest per-acre pecan yield in a drought year on record. I stood at the podium with my grandfather's ledger in one hand and a single typed sheet of numbers in the other. 1,840 pounds per acre, against a county average of 1,110, water usage down 60% from the synthetic fertilizer rows on the same property. $0 spent on irrigation beyond what the creek and the ditches already carried. I read the figures once, plainly, without embellishment, the way my grandfather taught me to present a fact, which is to let it stand on its own weight and not dress it up in feeling. Roy Dennison sat in the third row, and I watched him check the figures against a printout of his own extension bulletin twice, his jaw working the way a man's jaw works when a number refuses to be argued with. When the floor opened for questions, he stood, and for a moment I thought he'd repeat the word anecdotal one more time. Instead, he asked, quietly, whether I'd be willing to let the Extension Office document the soil composition for a formal case study. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first time in 2 years he'd asked me a question instead of correcting one. Doris Calvert didn't speak at all. She sat near the back with her hands folded in her lap, and when the meeting broke for coffee, she left without buying any. Preston Hargrove stood when I finished, and in front of 40-some neighbors, a county commissioner, and a reporter from the regional paper who'd driven out after hearing about the yield numbers, he offered the Aldermere's full produce contract at a price per pound 30% above what Cresthaven had ever offered any other grower on the ridge. 3-year term, no exclusivity clause restricting what else I could sell, and an option, if I wanted it, to consult on soil practices for the resort's own struggling grounds crew. I told him I'd accept the contract on the condition that Cresthaven fund an independent water study of the creek, the same creek his development's runoff had disturbed back in February of last year, and that the study be filed publicly with the county. He agreed before his own attorney could stop him. Marguerite Salas, standing near the back, said nothing at all. It's been 6 years since that meeting, and the ledger has grown by 4 more volumes, all in my own hand now, though I still catch myself writing in my grandfather's clipped shorthand without meaning to. The Aldermere contract renewed twice, and now carries a clause I insisted on in the second renewal, capping how much of my acreage could ever be dedicated to their supply chain, because I never wanted this land run like a factory floor. Not for Hargrove, not for anyone. Preston Hargrove left Cresthaven 3 years ago for a competing developer 2 states over. The last I heard, he still tells the fish story at industry conferences, though now he tells it as a lesson in listening to local knowledge instead of a joke at my expense. Roy Dennison retired from the Extension Office last spring, and before he left he published that case study he'd asked to document, Fungal Soil Networks and Slow-Release Organic Amendment in Drought-Resilient Orchard Systems, my grandfather's name listed in the acknowledgments alongside mine, which is more credit than I ever expected from a man who once called 40 years of field notes anecdotal. Doris Calvert sold her property to a younger couple in 2023 and moved to be near her daughter in Asheville. We never spoke again after the exchange meeting, and I've made peace with that. I never sold the 86 acres, and I never diluted the method for speed or profit, even when 3 separate agricultural startups came calling in the years after the case study went semi-viral in farming circles, offering to license my grandfather's soil practices as a branded product line. I turned every one of them down. Some things aren't meant to scale. Last month I handed the newest ledger, the 22nd volume since 1961, to my niece Callie, who's 22, and has been walking these rows with me since she was small enough to ride on the tailgate. I watched her read the line my grandfather underlined 3 times, "Water remembers what soil forgets," and I told her the only thing worth telling, that everyone on this ridge who ever laughed at me is still, in some way, waiting to find out if patience was going to make a fool of me or make me right, and some questions only the land itself gets to answer, on its own schedule, whether anyone's still watching or not. Callie asked me last week if I ever think about what would have happened if I'd just taken Preston Hargrove's $2.1 million that first winter and walked away clean. I was about to answer her when my phone buzzed with a message from a woman 2 counties over, asking if the same fish method could save an almond grove her own grandmother left her. One the bank was already circling, and if you've sat through this whole story instead of clicking away, you've already told me something about what you believe patience is worth. So go ahead and subscribe, because her answer is the next video, and it doesn't end the way anyone sitting across a desk at that bank, in a suit that's never once touched dirt, expects it to.